In Module 3, we'll look at how Indigenous people became incorporated into the global system. We'll start with an overview of the colonial stage and Indigenous interactions with both settlers and colonial governments. Although we'll be reading about events that occurred during the long 16th century, many of the interactions described are still occurring today in some parts of the world. We'll also end with a brief description of treaties, why and how they were created, as well as what they mean for Indians today. In Chapter 1 of Victims of Progress, Bodley describes small-scale, large-scale, and global-scale cultures. They differ from each other based on their population size and also the amount of centralized power. Bodley explains that small-scale cultures would be best represented by hunters and gatherers, although it seems he would also include cultures that engage in pastoralism or horticulture in this group. These are small populations, usually less than 100 or up to a few hundred people, and there's very little centralization of power. Community groups are loosely defined, and people may belong to more than one. Decision-making in small-scale cultures is done as a community. Persuasive speakers encourage others to adopt their strategies or support their desired choices. Decision-making may require some time, but there's generally time available for lengthy discussions in which anyone may take part. Although for sure certain individuals would be more gregarious and opinionated, others less so, and some will be respected more by the group. The community might also split apart when an amicable decision cannot be reached, with disgruntled individuals leaving either temporarily or permanently to live with different communities to which they also belong. There may be some separation of power depending on the culture. For example, the amount of power that women have within the community to affect decisions will vary from one culture to the next. Large-scale cultures have bigger populations and politicization. Not everyone is involved in decisions anymore. Decisions are now more centralized compared to small-scale societies. Leaders generally incur attacks from non-leaders. Finally, division of labor makes members more dependent on society than in small-scale cultures where all production is done at the household level. In a large-scale culture, one cannot just leave the society if one is disgruntled and expect to be able to reproduce one's lifestyle on one's own. Global scale cultures are organized by commercial interests above and beyond political or human interests, such as food, shelter, defense, and social needs. Division of labor occurs, as with large-scale cultures, but on a bigger scale. Labor might be imported across continents, for example. Raw resources might be extracted from one continent, transported across political and cultural boundaries to another continent where they are refined into a value-added product, and then transported yet again for sale on yet a different continent. Global scale cultures emerged with the rise of a global economy, which had its root in the colonial era and concurrent increase in capitalism. The global economy is based on the premise that there should be minimal barriers to the flow of labor and resources. Capitalism and colonization went hand in hand. Explorers, adventurers, and capitalists, primarily from European countries, traveled the globe in search of inexpensive sources of resources and labor. Governments established colonial outposts in far-flung locations across the globe, not because they wanted to expand their territory, but to provide a stable environment that would facilitate the extraction of resources to fuel capitalism. With this model, a minimal fee, if any, is paid to the country of origin for the raw materials. The processed materials become a value-added product that could command a much higher price than the raw materials could. The country of origin of the natural resources has no rights to the enhanced value of the value-added commodities. Expansion of the capitalist world economy was predicated on encompassing all the people on the globe within the boundaries of a state. The concept of a state as a group of people occupying a territory under a common authority did not emerge until the 17th century. Prior to that, people lived in smaller groups, bands, tribes, or as serfs under a lord with other higher authorities such as kingdoms, empires, and religious jurisdictions, overlapping in a complex mosaic. With statehood, individual rights became a function of one's citizenship. Citizens of poor countries have no rights to the advantages afforded citizens of wealthy countries. The boundaries of many modern nation states are relics of colonization. Colonizing countries brought under their control tracts of land and the people in them based on the colonizing countries, goals and abilities. They were not concerned with colonizing a specific cultural group, but were instead interested in controlling areas that had desirable resources or areas that were advantageously located to facilitate trade and shipping. As a result, a colony could encompass a variety of different cultural groups and ethnicities, and likewise might bisect a number of cultural groups and ethnicities. The groups included in the colony, and later in the nation state when independence was granted, were not always allies. A good example is Africa, which was colonized extensively by several different European countries. The continent was carved into nation states, largely based on colonial boundaries. One nation may encompass several different cultural, religious, and linguistic groups. The borders of this country may also sever cultural, religious, and linguistic groups into two or more. In the map on this slide, the thicker dark line represents the borders of Tanzania, which are legacies of different colonial boundaries. The circles represent the locations of distinct cultural groups. The map was produced by the Zurich Ethnology Department. Nation states control those claiming the benefits from production and trade through laws, regulations, and taxation. Nation states are invested in seeing commercial enterprises flourish. Economic gains to private citizens translate to economic gains for the government through taxation. To these ends, states establish regulations that promote certain industries and exports. They may also curtail imports. They can facilitate the flow of resources to capitalist production by developing infrastructure, such as roads and ports, and providing protection, such as warships, that protected vessels trading slaves and plantation goods between Europe, Africa, and the Americas in the 16th century. Taking the lands of indigenous peoples through the use of force in order to provide more resources for capitalists is another way of increasing capitalist production. Two such types of force include punitive raids, which were brief displays of overwhelming force designed to intimidate the local population into relinquishing control of their resources, and wars of extermination, which peaked in the late 1800s as more settlers entered indigenous lands. The intent of wars of extermination is to remove the indigenous population entirely from the land so that it can be used by colonists who would engage in economic activity that strengthens the nation's economy. Indigenous populations often were not thought to belong in the state and were not granted the same rights as the rest of the population. American Indians, for example, were not granted the right to vote in U.S. elections until 1924. Indigenous populations are small in scale, and their cultures and political goals are quite different from the mainstream population. Instead of being viewed as equal citizens whose goals and needs should be addressed by the state, they're often seen as obstructions to progress that hold the country back. The result is a state that is responsive to the needs of the core at the expense of the concerns of the indigenous peoples. The incorporation of indigenous peoples into the political boundaries of nation states can roughly be divided into four stages: the pre-colonial stage, the colonial stage, independence movements, and liberation movements. Historians refer to the time prior to increased travel and colonization, primarily by Europeans, as the pre-colonial stage. This definition can really only be understood relative to the colonial stage, which was marked by an increase in European colonization that began in the 1400s and is associated with a rise in commercialization. Prior to commercialization and expansion of market economies, It is thought that large-scale cultures were limited because A, they were politically centralized, tended to be unstable, and often collapsed, and B, they were supported by subsistence agriculture alone, and as more distant territories were brought under control, the cost of organizing them began to outweigh the economic benefit they brought, particularly in less productive regions. Nevertheless, the Mongol Empire, which evolved as a result of colonial imperialism in the 1200s, remains to this day the largest empire in the world. It stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to the Sea of Japan. For colonists, the frontier presents an area inviting entrance, and indigenous groups first encountered individual colonists acting on their own self-interests. These would have been trappers, traders, settlers, missionaries, and labor recruiters. In the absence of any governing authority, exploitative tactics were easily employed by colonists. Many considered the local population subhuman, and they saw nothing wrong in forcing Indians from their lands, even killing them to do so. During the colonial stage, indigenous peoples were routinely displaced and dispossessed of their lands. Once depopulated, the frontier resources could be claimed by the colonists. Between 1750 and 1930, tribal populations were reduced in number by 30 to 50 million people. Many of these deaths were due to disease, but many were also due to warfare, forced labor, and the economic hardships indigenous peoples endured at the hands of colonists and colonial entities. One of the most striking examples occurred in Tasmania. Prior to 1803, estimates of the local Tasmanian population varied between 3,000 and 15,000. By 1833, the indigenous Tasmanian population had dwindled to just 200 people due to disease and the Black War, which was launched by British colonialists in 1803 to depopulate the island. The last 200 people surrendered under the false pretense that their lands would be returned to them. Instead, they were exiled to Flinders Island, and then later moved to an ex-convict settlement on Tasmania. Their population was so decimated by wars of extermination and subsequent exile that there are no more full-blooded Tasmanians living today. The last full-blooded Tasmanian died in 1876 or 1905, there being some uncertainty about who the last full-blooded Tasmanian was. The removal of people from their homelands through the use of force was considered justified based on several related ideologies. Social Darwinism is a theory of social evolution modeled on Darwin's theory of evolution of the species and natural selection. But note that Charles Darwin himself did not support the idea of social Darwinism or of improving human society through selective breeding. Starting with the long 16th century, Europeans began to travel far and wide across the globe, and in doing so collected lots of data about different cultural groups. The data was collected mostly by merchants, traders, and missionaries, as well as naturalists who would also collect human specimens, usually dead but not always, and some, both live and dead, found their way into museums as exhibits. On studying the data, European thinkers, naturalists, politicians, and travelers concluded that societies evolved over time on a linear trajectory. Several early anthropologists described the stages of this evolution. For example, in 1877, Henry Louis Morgan published Ancient Society, in which he outlined a pathway of social evolution thusly. At the beginning stages were savages who had never domesticated plants or animals. These were followed by barbarians, whose emergence was symbolized by the introduction of pottery. And the end stage was considered civilization, which occurred when society developed a written language. While the terms and defining characteristics might change slightly from one to the next, they all agreed that Europeans, and later European Americans, Canadians, Australians, Boers, etc., represented civilization at the top or end point of human social evolution, that all cultures would follow the same trajectory, and to understand one's past, one only had to look to the less advanced cultures who were assumed to be stuck in the past. By today's standards, the research that was conducted is considered severely flawed. Much of the anthropologists didn't collect data firsthand themselves, but relied on second and third-hand reports told by travelers and merchants who likely misinterpreted and embellished quite a bit. But at the time, it was considered a sound scientific theory. This theory lent itself to the idea, also popular at the time among Europeans, that it was, in the words of Maybury Lewis, the natural order of things for stronger and more advanced peoples to conquer and rule over weaker and more backward ones. Once it was accepted as a scientific truth that colonists and settlers represented societies that were on higher rungs of the evolutionary ladder than the savages they confronted, then this provided moral justification for almost anything that the former might do to the latter. Because Europeans considered themselves superior to indigenous populations, they felt they had a right to lay claim to what they considered idle or underused resources, because they, the Europeans, could make better use of them than the indigenous populations. As Theodore Roosevelt explained in his book, The Winning of the West, From the Alleghenies to the Mississippi, 1769 to 1776, the settler and the pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages. Colonists further reasoned that claiming indigenous land would benefit the indigenous population, as they would be able to witness firsthand how a civilized society made use of their resources by increasing their value through industry and hard work. Dubbed The White Man's Burden after a poem by Rudyard Kipling of the same name, the idea was that the more evolved societies had an obligation to educate and uplift the less evolved, and appropriating their resources in the name of civilization was one way to do so. These ideologies also included components of national destiny. The colonizing nations had found a better way forward in the commoditization of goods and services, the creation of a meritocracy, and the increased productivity of the Industrial Revolution. Nation-states should not let savages waylay them on their path to creating great societies. That local populations may experience terrible atrocities in the process of nation building was terrible, but a necessary evil. In the words of Theodore Roosevelt, whether the whites won the land by treaty, by armed conquest, or, as was actually the case, by a mixture of both, mattered comparatively little so long as the land was won. It was all important that it should be won, for the benefit of civilization and in the interests of mankind. It is indeed a warped, perverse, and silly morality which would forbid a course of conquest that has turned whole continents into the seats of mighty and flourishing civilized nations. All men of sane and wholesome thought must dismiss with impatient contempt the plea that these continents should be reserved for the use of scattered savage tribes, whose life was but a few degrees less meaningless, squalid, and ferocious than that of the wild beasts with whom they held joint ownership. Here's another quote by Theodore Roosevelt, also expressing sentiments that were, while not universal, quite common at the time. The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages, though it is apt to be also the most terrible and inhuman. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the land lays all civilized mankind under a debt to him. American and Indian, Boer and Zulu, Cossack and Tartar, New Zealander and Maori, in each case the victor, horrible though many of his deeds are, has laid deep the foundations for the future greatness of a mighty people. The consequences of struggles for territory between civilized nations seem small by comparison. Looked at from the standpoint of the ages, it is of little moment whether Lorraine is a part of Germany or of France, whether the northern Adriatic cities pay homage to Austrian Kaiser or Italian king. but it is of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. The process of separating indigenous peoples from their economic base creates a population that is no longer able to provide for itself, yielding a labor force that can be had for little or no pay. Having lost their territories and access to resources, the local population was easily exploited as wage laborers or corvée, which is unpaid labor. Corvée was widely used in colonial economies in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia to extract resources and develop infrastructure. The labor was often brutal, and for many there was no escape. They were maintained as slaves. The colonizing forces justified this as a way to educate backwards populations in the ways of commerce and industry. If these populations had been allowed to persist engaged in their traditional ways of life, and had not had their lands and freedoms forcibly removed from them, they would not have the opportunity to be exposed to civilizing forces and would have continued on as savages or barbarians, perhaps evolving into civilizations, but only slowly. Several international organizations promoted colonial activities as a means of bringing civilization to backwards people and stamping out barbaric customs by providing examples of how industrial nations did things. Although it seemed harsh that indigenous peoples had to have their lands and sometimes even their lives taken, it was considered worthwhile in that it provided them the opportunity to see how great nation states made the most use of their resources. Independence movements resulted in the colonies gaining independence, but often there was little change for the marginalized populations in the newly independent nation states. In the United States, Canada, and Mexico, for example, independence meant the former colonies were no longer under direct rule of Britain or Spain. For the indigenous population, however, often little changed. They were still small-scale cultures marginalized by the large and increasingly global-scale cultures around them. Internal colonialism describes the role of indigenous populations in a newly independent nation state. While the colonial populations gain independence from their former colonizers, the indigenous populations remain second-class citizens. From their perspective, nothing much changes with independence except the colonizing force. Once granted independence, nation-states may experience neocolonialism. Neocolonialism occurs when a politically independent country, usually a former colony, continues to be controlled by outside forces, usually the former colonizing country, through economic, cultural, or linguistic means. This is especially true when the nation-state has a weak economy and infrastructure. The newly formed state may be dependent on foreign economic aid to develop its educational system or provide basic health care for its citizens. That aid may include directives on how the newly independent country is to develop or govern itself, both domestically and internationally, usually using a model based on the lending country or in ways that are at least advantageous to the lending country. Newly independent states that assume the language and adopt many of the cultural elements of their foreign colonizers create a successful platform of operation for the corporations that persist following independence. And usually these are multinationals or affiliated with the former colonizing country. These corporations may control the majority of the state's exports, providing them with the ability to manipulate costs. The result may very well resemble colonialism, with international interests accruing most of the benefits of resource extraction and only little economic benefit being accrued domestically. Liberation movements and revolutions are characterized by attempts by indigenous peoples to throw out capitalists and colonialists and reclaim their land and territories. There was a marked increase in these movements starting in the 1970s. An example is the OPM, or Free Papua movement, mentioned earlier. The revolting populations are often not well armed or funded. They may fight with spears and axes, guns and bombs, make use of nonviolent means such as demonstrations, or a combination of all of the above.
Treaty making was another means of extending government control over indigenous resources, but usually as a last resort under great duress on the part of the indigenous group, such as after a punitive raid. Again, here's Theodore Roosevelt on treaty making. As a matter of fact, the lands we have won from the Indians have been won as much by treaty as by war, but it was almost always war, or else the menace and possibility of war, that secured the treaty. For the part of the colonists, treaties were not the ideal solution. As Theodore Roosevelt put it, no treaty could be satisfactory to the whites, no treaty served the needs of humanity and civilization, unless it gave the land to the Americans as unreservedly as any successful war. In fact, many treaties were written such that the local population gave away most of their rights. An agent of the government then found someone who they assumed to be a tribal leader, usually one person, usually a man following the European style of governance, and they secured their signature. The signatory may or may not have been the leader and may or may not have understood what they were signing. Many treaties were so sweeping in context, for example, all the rights and powers of any kind or nature, whatever, that it seems unlikely the reader understood them. Although by definition, treaties are legally binding documents, they have not been treated as such, particularly when one party has far less power than the other. Theodore Roosevelt even went so far as to claim that treaties are in fact not binding and never have been. He wrote, "No treaties, whether between civilized nations or not, can ever be regarded as binding in perpetuity. With changing conditions, circumstances may arise which render it not only expedient, but imperative and honorable to abrogate them." Society has obviously changed quite a bit since the colonial era, and today native sovereignty is firmly recognized by the U.S. government, although there continue to be many court cases surrounding the specific details. The U.S. government now recognizes treaties as the supreme law of the land, and in describing the legal status of tribes, the Bureau of Indian Affairs chooses not the words of Teddy Roosevelt, but the words of U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, who in the 1830s said, "Tribes possess a nationhood status and retain inherent powers of self-government." The amount of free agency that tribes actually experience as sovereign nations within the borders of the United States has flowed and ebbed over the years. It is at a high point today compared to even recent history, when U.S. policy often limited native freedoms. In 1970, Richard Nixon spoke to Congress of the need to strengthen the Indian sense of autonomy without threatening his sense of community. The 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed to meet these ends. In its passing, Congress stated its finding that federal domination of Indian affairs had deprived American Indians of leadership skills and had denied Indians an effective voice in planning and implementing programs. The act created a process through which a tribe may contract with the federal government to provide the social service granted them through treaty making and manage their own natural resources, which are held in trust for them by the federal government. The tribal service provider remains under the authority of the federal agency that they have contracted with. To some degree, the tribe can tailor the goods and services to reflect their cultural values, resulting in services that are more effective and which better address the needs of the tribe. However, the service provider must also follow guidelines set forth by the contracting agency on appropriate management. The Indian Child Welfare Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, both passed in 1978, are further examples of the federal government's recognition and support of tribal sovereignty. The shift in perception of Indigenous rights is reflected globally. In 2007, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which encourages nation-states to ensure protection of Indigenous rights, including survival, dignity, and well-being, as well as protections of cultural heritage and genetic resources. The United States adopted the Declaration in 2010. In October of 2010, the U.S. government recognized 565 tribes. This number fluctuates even today. The federal government terminates federal recognition in some cases, while in others, Indians successfully appeal for recognition. Federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations with the ability to govern themselves. Many of these tribes also possess treaty rights that explicitly reserve their hunting and gathering and use rights on lands not under their direct control, so in other words, on off-reservation lands. These treaty rights are sometimes in contention, just as tribal status is. Tribes might petition to have treaties recognized, and federal or state governments might petition to have treaty rights terminated. The following is an example of some treaty rights that are upheld today, just to give you a taste for the variety there is. Between 1854 and 55, tribes in Washington were granted protection of the right to fish for salmon in their accustomed fishing grounds, even if these were off-reservation. In 1855, the Makah, also a tribe in Washington, signed the Treaty of Neah Bay, in which they ceded 300,000 acres of their tribal lands and were granted in exchange the federal government's protection of their right to whale. In 1896, the Blackfeet in Montana maintained the right to hunt, fish, and cut firewood in a portion of the Lewis and Clark National Forest, and the right to use the forest for spiritual purposes. As sovereign nations, reservations are not subject to state hunting and fishing laws. In many cases, tribes don't impose the same bag limits or seasonal restrictions on hunting and fishing done by tribal members on tribal lands as states do. Some tribes may not impose any restrictions. Once considered poaching by states, litigation began in the 1940s and 50s led to federal and state recognition of the right of tribes to regulate their own hunting and fishing. Tribes are subject to some national conservation acts, such as the Eagle Protection Act, but not all. This is not to say that tribes don't have poachers. Tribes have problems with poachers just as states do. The unsanctioned whaling that occurred with members of the Makah tribe in 2007 is one example. In this case, tribal members engaged in a whaling expedition that was not sanctioned by the tribe as a means of protest against threats to Makah whaling rights. The event caused an incredible amount of negative publicity for the Makah tribe. Other examples would include non-natives that hunt or fish on tribal lands without first acquiring tribal permits or tags. The state tag is not valid on tribal lands, so if you're going to hunt and fish on tribal lands, even by invitation, you want to make sure you're following the tribal regulations on hunting and fishing. Tribes have their own police and justice systems, but they are limited in their ability to prosecute non-natives, and only the federal government could try felony crimes that occurred on reservations. There are two instances when tribal members can hunt and fish off-reservation and not be held responsible to state hunting and fishing laws. These occur if tribal members are hunting and fishing on ceded lands. So ceded lands are lands that Indians gave up ownership to the U.S. in exchange for treaty rights. If the U.S. recognizes a treaty in which the tribe retained their right to hunt and fish in their usual and accustomed locations. So if they had a treaty agreement in which the native population gave up rights to their lands but maintained the right to hunt and fish there, then they can still hunt and fish there. They're not subject to state laws, but they will be subject to tribal laws if there are any. They may also have this right if Congress reduced the size of their reservation or terminated it, but left their fishing and hunting rights intact. So if they had prior hunting and fishing rights as a result of treaty making, and their reservation was reduced or terminated, they will still have those hunting and fishing rights. So this does not mean that any Native American can hunt or fish anywhere in the United States without following state laws. It means that members of specific tribes that have specific treaties which are recognized by the United States can hunt and fish according to what is stipulated in that treaty. Usually, it's stipulated that they can hunt and fish in their usual and accustomed grounds. In some cases, tribal hunting and fishing on ceded lands is not subject to state bag limits or seasons at all. In other cases, there may be a season that starts earlier and or ends later than that for state residents. And sometimes there are different seasons for different harvesting methods, such as spear versus rod and reel fishing. Tribes may be given a bag limit or share a bag limit with other tribes. Tribes are not necessarily subject to the same restrictions on what can be harvested, so for example, antlerless deer, as state residents are. It's impossible to generalize about off-reservation tribal hunting rights, as the laws are specific to the tribe, the treaty, the state, the specific species of game or fish, and the most recent court ruling. Mainstream populations sometimes protest treaty rights and the different hunting and fishing regulations that apply to tribes with treaty rights. They feel that different management for tribal and non-tribal hunting and fishing is discriminatory. In addition, mainstream hunting and fishing is managed as a sport, and the intent is to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity to hunt and fish. Lottery systems for tags, bag limits, and seasons ensure that the U.S. population has equal opportunity to hunt and fish, while keeping the number of game taken at sustainable limits. They may view treaty rights, therefore, as being in direct competition with sport hunting, and also not in keeping with allowing everyone equal opportunity. Tribes, on the other hand, view hunting and fishing very differently. For many tribes, hunting of a certain species is central to their cultural and religious identity, and a highly ritualized hunt may be required to fulfill certain spiritual obligations or ceremonies. In addition, hunting and fishing might provide important parts of the diet. Indians living on reservations generally do not hunt for sport, and they are not concerned that everyone in the tribe has equal opportunity to hunt. Rather, hunters are providing a service for their community. Not all families will have a hunter in them, so some hunters must hunt for their own family and for another family. Mainstream populations concerned with indigenous hunting may complain that the indigenous people aren't hunting as they traditionally would, and that this must negate their treaty rights. They attempt to place parameters on what constitutes indigenous hunting cultures and may object to the use of modern technology, such as powerboats and rifles, or trading the catch as opposed to consuming it directly, or even a return to hunting after a self-imposed ban, reasoning that the tribe survived without the hunting, fishing, or whaling during the ban, so they don't really need to do it anymore. Wealth is sometimes also used as an objection, with the argument being that the hunting, fishing, or whaling is not necessary when one has money to buy food in the store. The indigenous perspective might counter that cultures have always changed and adapted to new technologies. Adopting powerboats may not change for them what they believe are the important aspects of their fishing. So these are things like being respectful, asking forgiveness, sharing the catch, and often not taking more than is needed. They argue that their native fishing hasn't changed any more than driving to church instead of walking or riding in a horse-pulled wagon we take away from the religious experience. To be sure, we can think of religions that would object to driving to church, the Amish, for example. The key to the discussion is whether the objection comes from members of the church or non-members. Are the Amish deciding what is and is not in keeping with their religion or culture, or are outsiders deciding for them? As for trade, some tribes have historically engaged in trade with other tribes living in different areas, so it may in fact be a part of their traditional economies. The Makah, for example, traditionally traded whale meat and blubber with inland tribes, and later with colonists and whaling ships. Finally, there was never a stipulation of need, which would be hard to define, when the treaty rights in question were agreed to. They are not a form of social security for which the benefiting population must be under a certain income bracket to receive. Rather, the treaty rights were granted indefinitely in most cases, in exchange for territories the indigenous people ceded to the government and power. Today, tribes that have treaty rights often feel they are necessary in allowing the group to practice their cultural and religious